Welcome back to this introduction of the greatest challenge of digital. So back then we said digital technologies as key technology of the 21st century. Obviously, we argue it's not the only important technology with this historical moment, but it is argued that as a key technology of the 21st century, it has a specific domain of application because it's an enabling technology that touches also all the other technologies, such as nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, digital. It's transversal, and it's a technology that characterizes our productive activities, personal life and collective life in the 21st century. It's a bundle of complex technologies that has a very great impact, that lend themselves to many reflections, and that in the first part I tried to use this sort of poem, digital machines, do they interest me? To try to make, not only to make order in some fundamental concepts, but also on priorities, obviously from my specific point of view. I hope it's a broad way of viewing at these things, and I'm trying to summarize, like we discussed, like in order to have to shed further light on what we have said of a certain number of important bundles of digital challenges. So the fact that human beings produce artifacts, some simple, some more complicated, the most complicated with very different parts that we call machines. We have pointed out that digital machines, which in a short way are referred to as MD, have a growing influence on all kinds of human actions, even if only trivially, because we always go around with a smartphone, which is our helper, our mediator of many actions. Of how digital machines, in addition to being digital machines, the queen being the smartphone, they are also digital machines that permeate other machines and objects, such as digital machines they are colonizing even objects that are very simple and traditional. And we spoke of how digital machines have, let's say, they follow the human body. For example, they record data on the human body, the heartbeat and other things, but also how they can influence the human body, even only because they measure and they measure it, and they read by reading a piece of data on our screen, we change our behavior, how we talk, how we speak, and so on. And these digital machines measure a lot of information about the environment, also the human body, where the human body is located, like ambient brightness and the space, and so on. We spoke about how digital machines are increasingly digital intermediaries between humans and the rest of the world. In English, we talk about gatekeeper. So how these digital machines are gatekeepers, are an interface, but it's a bit more than an interface that can include or exclude us, and of how digital machines finally are governed by a few, and these few also possess the computing power that we also have computing power, a smartphone and even computer. Therefore, the computing power, but compared to, it's very low compared to other computing powers that are very held by governments. They're very large, and there are very large amounts of comparable data that are much, much bigger. So the topics, and with the phase that, it's a descriptive observation of information on digital machines. And this last part, you will remember, we spoke about what are the topics of interest, what interests me personally, but also other intellectual scholars, there are other intellectual scholars that deal with digital. They're interested in the birth, let's say, in the creation of digital machines. Who decides? For example, Steve Jobs, who decided to create the iPhone in the year 2000, and in the years before 2007 when it was actually born. So who designs these machines, who builds them materially, physically, under what conditions, who repairs them, because you want a second life for them. But we could further dig into that. Who can repair, who can dispose of these machines, what happens when they become obsolete, and what happens when they end. What's the birth and death of digital machine? What do they do, this digital machine? What can they do? How do they do it? Do they take photographs? And where do they end up? Why do they do certain things? Why don't they do others? What price? Which is the price? Which are the unforeseen price and that emerge only over time? The fact of measuring the ambient brightness that was originally bored to turn off the screen, when I approached the screen to the face to make a phone call, but when I discovered years later that the information freely accessible to many apps on our phone. So I can deduce that how big the apartment in which I live is, and what floor is so on. So at what price was not expected. So originally by those who put that ambient light sensor inside the phone, in favor of those who they do certain things, these digital machines, and also potentially against who they do it. Let's take an example, not to leave into abstract, when certain so-called platform jobs that come, that they have, so they hire workers, and these workers actually interface with humans. So they build an interface with an algorithm. The algorithm tells them to do something, specific things like deliver such a package into such place and so on. Well, these algorithms can also be deciding to ask workers and not giving them the most opportunities for works and therefore for profit. And this is a counter who is widely discussed. This is a problem that is widely discussed in recent years by laborers, lawyers, and so on. And then what we do we care about what we humans do with these digital machines? How do we use them? What do you use them for? So these conditions are, what are the consequences of the use like we said, with the smartphone in our hands, we decide to use them in a certain ways there rather than other ways beyond the machine itself. So doing a number of things independently that what are sometimes not aware that it's also interesting. There are various directions of research, various disciplines. And then last point, remember what we could do or we could not, and which right now they don't do. So let's say acknowledge what they do, but they could do something else. But for some reason they do it. Why they don't do it? Would we want them to do it? Or the opposite, what digital machines already do, and that maybe if we think about it with more information, maybe they shouldn't do. If you think about the whole issue of personal data protection, therefore a lot of data that's been collected, for example, smartphones, they continue to give the usual example, this machine that collects an amazing amount of data. What emerges from these years of research, that in certain cases the right solution would be not to collect certain data, not to treat them differently, no, simply just not collecting them for a number of reasons, and that would be the right choice from the point of view of the interests of many. Okay, a small summary of the main topics that are key to reading that I've proposed to you, to put some order in the thinking, in the reasoning on the great digital challenge, and they are mainly, this is mainly a reasoning where the technical reasoning is important, because it allows you to understand what is possible, what is not possible, what is likely, what is a utopia, what is dystopian. But above all, it's somehow a broader thinking, a broader reflection than saying, yes, it's fine. We are computer engineers, we're capable of developing certain things, but as you have seen, it was more of an implicit reasoning and saying, so it's all reasoning about technology and society. So this is all this number of 24 bundle of 24 courses called the Great Challenges, which this is an introductory lesson on digital that will be flanked by other introductory lessons on 5 other great challenges. So let's add something more to this introductory lesson before leaving the floor to the 4 pairs of teachers that will cover the courses that form this course on great challenges. Before we do it, let's think about how we talk about digital. So I'm a computer engineer, so somehow for professional reasons I also follow the media public narrative of how we talk about computers, internet, social media, and so on. And now I have sufficient experience for reasons that are just to notice a certain way of talking about digital that it seems to me very important to make explicit with you, and also in a way that you are more aware, also to develop the corresponding antibodies that are necessary, in my opinion. What am I talking about? But the fact that the discourse on digital, we could also call the narrative, is fashionable, but it goes by waves. Let's just think about this century, these 20 years, in the last 20 years. If you were to resume newspapers, television, TV sites over the last 20 years, when it comes to digital, there has been stories in waves. These waves, I remember, a few years ago, we were talking about cloud computing, the computer on the cloud. I would say a bit more than 10 years ago. And then we started talking about big data. Everything was big data. Everything was big data. Everything was the center of everything. Then in recent times, we heard about talking about blockchain and artificial intelligence. Now a bit more self-driving cars that look like imminent. So these waves, they typically come from Silicon Valley in the United States. They come and they saturate media communication for months, in some cases for years. It seems that the most important thing that is that thing, computing, big data, cloud computing, big data, and so on. Ministers talk about it, head of states talk about it, directors talk about it, scholars talk about it, journalists. So for a while, it seems that there's only that, and that we must immediately, absolutely invest resources, do something, make courses, make sure that companies understand this, that people understand the new technologies, etc. But someone could tell me, well, of course, there's a technological development and it's normal that you can do them. Yes, for a certain point of view, in the sense that every time behind this label, there's a technical substance, technical, industrial, financial, and so on. So it's not just about media waves. Let's go back to that slide we were looking at before. Cloud computing, what is it? What does it mean? It means that services that were previously typically run on a computer or local servers Now we have service suppliers who have several computers located in a special factories, we could call them farms, and say, don't keep the computer at home. We can provide you with this service, more functionality. It will cost you less. So trust us. So Dropbox, Amazon Web Service, Microsoft Azure, and so on. So technical, economical, and also it's very important from the management of data point of view. It's very interesting. And I must say, as regards blockchain, because there's no fascinating algorithm behind, let's say, clearly all these things have a very interesting technical content behind, but there's also a lot of marketing. Also starting from the choice of words. Who choose those words? Sometimes it's a researcher. It was a researcher. Marketing experts. Sometimes it's researchers with marketing mentality. They use expressions. When I say marketing, it means someone who wants to sell something. So they use seducing words. In fact, think of like a cloud computing. Think of it. It's clearly a non-technical expression. The cloud is soft, it's light, it's attractive as a word. So it's a marketing expression. Also big data that evokes, in English, evokes the reflection of the 50s and 60s, where we talked about big labor, big unions, big government, the big governments that won World War II. Big business, like large companies and large corporations. So evoking this linguistic legacy, someone invented the concept of big data. It's also an expression for marketing, but also artificial intelligence, an expression that was created by researchers from a legendary seminar that was held in 1956. It lasted about 1 month. And computers were still relatively few, and researchers started to be interested in how we label as artificial intelligence. So how to translate automatically from one language to another, for example, from Russian. So we were in the middle of an automatic war on English. So they choose a seductive expression because intelligence is a very important word. It's seducing because everyone wants intelligence. We want to be intelligent. We want intelligent organizations. We want everyone. So creating this expression, artificial intelligence, was quite a successful and a remarkable marketing operation, because huge funding arrived especially from the American government, to develop something as seducing as artificial intelligence suggests. So we have a very recent, robust technical development. So because we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, and this it's an expression that has marketing characteristics. So there's no universally shared definition of what artificial intelligence is. So it was not a concept that was a definition that was developed just for technical reasons. So you have to understand that these waves come and go. There's a base of technical content, but there's always behind someone who wants to sell something, someone who wants to sell products, services for totally legitimate, and it's totally legitimate. And they're from big technological companies. They create media waves, and they create great emphasis because there's also speculative elements. One example above all, let's talk about self-driving cars. This is a screenshot of a page on Wired. It's called the Bible of Silicon Valley. It's a magazine, and they increase, they inflate these media waves. This is from October 2018, so more than 3 years ago, when there was the peak of attention for self-driving cars. There was a sort of a kind of a self-driving car guide, and it seemed that autonomous self-driving cars were just about to come to market. So it was said that it was literally imminent, that the technology was mature, it was a must, and the media wave created an expectation in that period, that was just 3 years ago, as if it was about to happen. So 1 year later, October 2019, The Economist, they say self-driving cars are stuck in traffic, and how they usually use that as headlines. So blame Silicon Valley hype, blame the marketing. So what happened? In reality, driving a car in complicated cities, in the urban environment, it's complicated, especially European cities. It's so complicated that an expert that was quoted, who works for the driving aspect for Google, says self-driving cars, that the dog running the ball, passing through, there are all things, the children crossing the street, all these are things that happen. It's a complex environment. So they say they will appear during the next 30 to 50 years. So let's move from self-drive machines that are about to hit the market, to something that is going to happen in 1 or 2 generations. So this means that we are still very far away from the result. But technology is far away. So as far as our lives are concerned, that won't concern you because you're young. But our life, if you tell me about something that will happen in 30 to 40 years, it's a bit far away from me. Same thing about nuclear fusion energy. If we're able to achieve in an economical, sustainable way, we should solve a crucial problem of our civilization, which is the energy. We should displace it, move it into the future, because it's not something that is going to happen very soon. So an actual development won't happen soon. So there are fields where developments were made, but it's still far away from. We're still far away from having these developments on the market. Let's move on. Remember Uber, they said, oh no, we will take care about developing self-driving, and we undermine this problem. We have governments around the world that create problem by saying that driver treat them badly. So at the end of 2020, they sell the division they had created for the development of self-driving cars. That is, Uber is, despite its very deep pockets, they say it's too far and it's too expensive. So this is an example of the dynamics that I've told you about. But as years went by, I also got another suspicion. These waves, they also have another side effect that is definitely not wanted. So there's a great a media conspiracy, but they just have a side effect. So there's no conspiracy. So researchers, we as researchers, politicians, but also politicians, we neglect other aspects of the overall digital frame. That's not the sexy, funny thing that we're talking about, that everyone, but that, like blockchain and so on. But nevertheless, they are important because clearly it's beautiful to talk about artificial intelligence. Developments of recent years are extraordinary. Certain specific areas that we need to talk about. But there are also other important things. And these important things, they remain under the radar. And this is a problem. So let's give ourselves as a goal, us as researchers, students, journalists, political decision makers, but in general, citizens who care about the community. And let's give a general goal that applies now to digital, but that should apply to everything. So let's give ourselves the tools to read reality, staying immune from propaganda, and by following our agenda. Well, based on the context, I could say, but what is my agenda as a university professor at the Polytechnic of Turin? Well, offer me a certain education technology. Yeah, I propose it, but me as a Polytechnic professor, do I want it? What's the pros and the cons? I could say, take the hat of political decision maker of Polytechnic and say, but what are the pros and the cons as institution? What do I want? And then go up to the university, Italy, Europe. So companies can be different and not necessarily aligned, but depending on the hat you're wearing, how exactly are things? Let's remove all the fluff. Let's remove the marketing and let's go directly to the heart of things and let's understand realistically what we're talking about. Well, at that point, we could evaluate and say that this new thing that comes out, the 5G, artificial intelligence, so on, do I need it? In which conditions I need it? And this applies to everything. What I'm saying is that it has to be a transversal, civil, and intellectual goal. We're talking about digital technology. It seems important to me to emphasize it precisely because the high degree of media dynamics and concern. So we try to go very well. We go beyond narratives, and we try to build them to acquire critical distance. And when you teach to high school boys and girls to read newspapers, you see the first page of the newspaper and you acquire the tools to decode that set of black symbols on a white background that compose the photographs that make up the front page of the newspaper. So what newspaper it is, what is the property, who is the director, will they have an agenda, legitimately an agenda because he puts on the front page this and not something else. That's what you could, or that's what they do on television. So let's say these 30 minutes, how are they structured? In which order are the topics? Because they are those topics, because they are not other topics, and so on. So, in short, these things that perhaps even some of you have done at school, and this fundamental ability that it's essential to be a citizen, not totally manipulated by the information that comes to us from the screen. And the same thing we should do with digital. So it's normal that there's a reaction, there's marketing, there's even propaganda. So let's try to give ourselves tools that are effective as much as possible to filter, to build, to have a critical distance. An important category that I found useful, that I personally found useful, that I propose to think about again, is not only digital but also many other things. But then let's talk about digital power. What's digital power? We mean the ability that an individual has or an entity has to make others do what one wants. So others don't want to do it, I could force them to do it, or maybe I could convince them. So others want you to do it, but you can make them do it. I wanted to do something, but that action has no functionality, because deliberately was put that the phone cannot do a certain thing. So the category of power is very material. It is a lot and therefore realistic reading of reality. And then the power of this first part of the 21st century is a power that we could say of digitalization of everything. And the word that is used again is the word smart. Smart is brilliant, is intelligent. And so it is smart at marketing level was attached to many objects: smartphone, smart glasses, smart watches. They're all typically in English, but they basically mean, as we already seen in the first part, the computerization, the digitalization of everything, of all the digital machines that invade everything, digital machines in their own right, in the home assistants, smartwatch, pre-existing machines or pre-existing objects such as glasses, which become smart. So in this short time we should grasp, if you will follow my course, you will listen more about this. We could talk about computerizing the world. So objects are computerized. I could also add spaces are digitalized. Cameras, smart cameras around the streets. They can do facial recognition. Like, for example, right now in Corso Duca di Abruzzi, someone is walking and he's tall and is 1 meter 80 centimeters high and has a red jacket. So not really facial recognition, but advanced recognition functions. And the city becomes computerized. Work environments can be computerized. Garbage bins can be computerized. So in some, globally, we could speak of a computerization of the world for various purposes: to sell products, to do surveillance, to measure many values, to collect data of all kinds, and so on. So this computerizing the world, we've seen a bit. Like the first line, remember, digital machines, am I interested? So the question I'm asking myself, that I ask you, that in part during not all the courses but all the four courses, so who is doing it? How is it done? For the benefit of whom? Not only the things that you find in the brochure, in brochures, like smart city in favor of citizens and so on, But others, there are others who take advantage. And what are the consequences? Perhaps the problem, one of the key problems, reflecting about technology, of what men does when they do, when making artifacts and machines, and what are the consequences on environment. We're all talking about climatic changes, global warming. The wonder of social media is not undermining democracy, undermining collective living, and the consequences. What are the consequences of the diffusion of technology, electricity, cars, and in more recent times, smartphones, social media, and so on. And talking about digital power, we distinguish between the power of digital and the power over digital. So what do we mean by the power of digital? Let's talk about, above all, the consequences of digital. Technology has consequences, so we could, in fact, say the power of digital technologies. So, from this point of view, as researchers in many fields, sociology, anthropology, economics, computer science, political and sciences, and so on, ask themselves questions about the consequences of digital technology on the planet. We have trillions of microchips in smartphones, large computers. Obviously, they have an impact on the planet, but because they have to build using natural resources, because they come in billions. So what happens to the environment? And this is an important category about workers. I'll give you an example of platform workers, which is perhaps the most current example, but there are many other examples in times, for example, in terms of pandemics, of confinements, that we have worked a lot online, often working from home, the so-called smart working, and other use of the smart word. So we have thousands of people who work for a specific company, and they use platforms, for example, Microsoft Teams or others. There's a collection of data on workers that we didn't have before, and this could be useful, but it could also have its critical points. As regards international relations, we have been talking a lot about digital between China and United States. We talk about it. So the fight on artificial intelligence between China and United States, the impact on democracy, attributing to social media is right. The research is still ongoing. Brexit, Trump election, and in short, typically the things that you like to blame social media about, maybe even with a basis of reason, maybe they're right. So what about interpersonal relationships? We make such an intense use of the smartphone that relationship have positive or negative effects on families between boyfriends, husband and wife, friends. So psychological well-being. And now there's, for decades, we were thinking about the psychological and social effects of television. Now we tend to take it for granted, but because it's always been there, it's always been a very great impact on now. But the same questions now, for the several years from now, are being asked about digital technologies and inequalities. Digital technology on this great theme of contemporaneity, which is inequality. What impact do inequalities have? What we do to dump them, and then think about, in recent years, the collapse of the number of sales of newspapers, and an incredible collapse. It's very quick in sales. How will information change? How will journalism change? Information change? Well, so it's going to be just journalists who will work just as freelancers. What will happen? It's a great transformation. And this kind of questions are questions where basically scholars from very different sectors study reality, often in a social reality or environmental reality, and they document it, they report it, they try to explain it, they try to say it's true or not that the Brexit was decided by Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. So this is a field, so it's things, collecting data, interview, and people, so on. If you want the study of power of digital, things have already happened. So this is fantastic. This is a line of research. You will surely encounter at least some of these things and the courses that follow, maybe even more courses that you will do in the continuation of your studies. And this list is totally non-exhaustive. I could have continued a long time, but just could give you an idea of what I mean of the power of digital, the consequences of digital. Then there's another topic that is very dear to me, is the power over digital. We already heard, I already mentioned something in my small poem. Who controls digital? Who decides what features are that has what features the next version will have of the most important operating systems and the apps? These questions are very important because they have a very big impact over the world. So who controls digital obviously has a big impact, like I say. So who controls digital technologies? This is indeed less studied, but in fact is a key topic. Although it is also implicit, where we give some elements to understand who controls digital technologies. I already replied, like I said, it's a monopoly. In the field of the desktop is monopoly. There's very few companies who manufacture microprocessors. So who produces smartphones, and then in the world a few companies. Like I said, at least for those who have a certain mentality, who should control digital technology, because if you say digital technology have a huge impact on the world and even on the planet. And if we believe democracy, if we believe in democracy, this concerns us. So those who control them have a great power over us, over our collective or democracies, and so on. So in this introduction, we have very little time to make summaries, and it would take dozens of hours to argue a document in detail. But what I say is a summary, clearly, with my interest, and it comes from my experience. It's my point of view, and I remain available to answer to any doubts or questions that you might have. But obviously, there's also issues that we will find with the teachers. You will hear again about from your teachers of the courses that you will follow, and so on. And I hope that these topics will remain in your mind, and then maybe they will feed the dialogue that you will have with your teachers. So in addition to other things that I think is a very interesting, and I want to conclude in my introduction to digital by saying that what we have anticipated here is a progressive computerization of the world. I want to add that what has been largely carried out in Europe and the Western world by American companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on, and it's strongly centralized way. So there are other elements. So those who computerize the world, especially some very large American companies. So by this I mean, and those that we know, the Google, Apple, Facebook, and the GAFA companies, and they're very, very big. It's what is their value? Just to give you an example, what is their value in the stock market? Their stock market value, it translates in figures that have no precedent in our world. 15 years ago, the world's big companies were much more 20th century, like General Electric, ExxonMobil, and they're quoted for hundreds of billions. Now these companies are much larger because we talk about trillions of dollars, thousands of billions, so trillions, and also with a very large growth during these 2 years of pandemic, because it was so clear that centrality of Google, Microsoft, and so on to carry on the work, the teaching, and so on, and they have a large value, and on the stock market they've grown a lot. So great from their point of view, and great technical skills, and the number of users they hire every day, the number of employees, which in reality is limited. There's Amazon that has many employees, the others much less. In fact, the specific in this slide is an advantage that acquires by these big techs, as they are also called as, an economic advantage, precisely very deep, and it's an advantage of technical know-how. Obviously, they have a minimum of 15 years of life, I think, of Facebook, almost 50 like Microsoft. They have an incredible advantage of data because they have been accumulating so much. So because Google, with such a stratospheric number of internet searches, so it's not only a sophisticated algorithm that has been fine-tuned in 20 years, but also can understand what people look for online. And their assets are so big that it can respond with so much data behind. They can say what searches are made in a specific area of the world, for example, in Apulia or in the market, and a certain time of the year. So these data is rich enough to be able to be provide important, valuable information. Let's say in a market during spring, certain things happen that are not the same that happen in Piedmont. So there's a hypothetically brilliant startup of young people from the Polytechnique who have an amazing idea for the best possible algorithm of web search. However, they don't have assets that have been already acquired. So the same thing could tell about purchases online, such as Amazon and so on. These companies they multiply, they have very close collaboration with governments, not only the American government, technical collaboration. In these recent months, we are talking the so-called national cloud of the Italian government and the partner. There are public companies, and partially we have these American companies. So it's not only a technical collaboration, which we could discuss about actually, but arguably that production to shape public opinion, and also for capillary surveillance, because these last 20 years are not only the first 20 years, that they are also the 20 years after the Patriot Act. September 11, 2001 created a basis for an unprecedented fact in history, that is mass surveillance. In Western democracies, it never happened that all the citizens were systematically monitored, their phone calls, their emails, and so on. After September 11th, this happened, and and in a way, it was proven beyond reasonable doubt thanks to Edward Snowden revelations in 2013, and it continues. The terrorism emergency continues to this day and can certainly be felt clearly less urgent than a few years ago, but nevertheless it was introduced in the wake of the emergency of the terrible events of September 11th. And recently we've also seen some events involving Europol, therefore European police education, where basically the political choice is that of not the one that someone might wish, that is to reduce mass surveillance that has a whole series of problematic profiles, but they want to further consolidate it. So to give shape to public opinion, it means that given the enormous power the platforms like Facebook, Twitter have to determine what is the attention of billions of people. You open the phone, you take a look, and you see certain things, and you don't see other, and it happens because there is an algorithm behind you. So the temptation of governments, even democratic one, even Western ones, is to say, well, you are private, and as private individuals, you're free to do many things. Try not to show certain things. Typically are things we are horrified about, or we feel dangerous about, terrorism and so on. But other things, for example, disinformation, fake news, this is a much more complicated area, because in totalitarian regimes we have the Ministry of Truth, which decides what is true. In democracy, truth is more complicated. And so to say that certain things are true and certain things are false, it's a slippery ground. It's not something that we should not tackle. It's a very slippery area, because we start saying what is true, what is not. Clearly, what is clearly false, we all agree it's false, but there's a zone where in democracy you need to proceed very, very cautiously, with extreme caution. So we have seen in recent years that governments tend to turn to these big companies, and so it's clear it's easy to ask them write down that this is doubtful, up to banning accounts and people who to talk about specific topics, even if they're not, far away from terrorism. There's a specific course about this that Professor Monacci is held by Professor Monacci, but I hope that it's something that we will talk about this, and I hope I've given you at least, how to say, the taste of the topic. So companies represent a huge concentration of power. It's just not me who says it, it's what even the current American president says, many intellectuals, many politicians, even in Europe. And I believe nothing controversial in pointing out that there is a concentration of power, therefore economic power, but economic power also implies a relevant political power. In this context, a strong subordination of Europe. And then we are not talking about Italy as its own structural problems, which do not concern digital, but it's more that general. In recent years, at the level of European Union, there's been a lot of talk of digital sovereignty, and these keywords and expressions do not correspond to there's been a great talk of digital sovereignty and do not correspond to all actions or necessary ambitions. There's a lot of talk about digital transition. There's also been a lot of talk about the so-called Next Generation Europe, the so-called PNRRE. But if you look the European digital, the American digital, we see there's a big gap. And so on. And the actions put in place so far are going in the right direction to try to mitigate this gap. But they are absolutely not the scale of necessary to really bridge it. But Europe has financial ability, has the scientific competence, skills. So we do have the brains. The money is there. So we could prove in principle, but then in practice we do not put in place the necessary resources. And why don't we do it? It's another context with more time. I could try to give you my answer, which is clearly not the truth, but obviously I'm dealing with these things. I wondered, but why? And the answer is very articulated. I could add various factors, but I think instead it's much more easily provable that the subordination of Europe is there. And what has been put in place so far is not enough to eliminate it. So what to do, and we are about to come to the conclusion and to the live moment, to the interaction with you and your questions and the insight of the case. Well, then, first of all, a general message. Now I'm going to tell you in this lesson, but it applies to everything. Nothing human is reversible. The future is not written. It doesn't mean that the future can be anything. Now that tomorrow the future could be radically different. The existing has created let's say a furrow somehow. So the reality has traced a furrow. We are inside this trace, which conditions a lot what we can do tomorrow. A bit less what we can do in 6 months, a little what we can do in a year, or less in 5 months. So there's a cone of possibilities. So we are in this groove actually. So we can continue. When I say nothing human is irreversible, so there's only a groove, and this groove has been traced, and it means you have to do this for next 5, 20, 30 years. It's false. It's not even true. Those who say everything is like Don Quixote, they say everything is possible. Why not? Because there's reality, the conditions, as a social reality, environmental reality. Of course, clearly everything can change, but we are in an intermediate space, and this is what we are interested about. So for some of these, there are possible actions in the right direction that seem, to me, they seem wise. Possible for some of these, it will take years. For others, maybe less time. So what is the right direction? What do you mean by right direction? Obviously, everything I've told you today is my introduction to digital. We arrive to my philosophical political position. I tell you here what, in my opinion, is the right direction relating technology. And to me, the right direction relating technologies, I want technology at the service of the many, at the service of people. So if you want, there's a contraposition, few, many, that is certainly that was made in ancient times, about 200 years ago, but Shelley, poet. So all technologies, they can be useful for many, but they've been often put in place and structured and in the interest of a few. So technology at the service of the many also means technologies that could be useful to many, but that in this moment are not developed because those who have the money to put them in place are not interested in them. So we need many, so not only those who make a lot of profit, with the primary goal of giving time back to people. So what do I mean this? Why I say it's philosophical? Because philosophically, a fundamental fact is that our life is as an end, so the way we use our time is the essential decision of our life. So how I use my time, how I use my finite time, then the technology is the reason why, and I'm proud of being an engineer. So someone who designs things, develops technology, is that technology has already been now, but it could be even more in the future, an extraordinary ally of human beings to gain time, to save efforts, to avoid injuries, to avoid work that's on the workplace, and more generally to gain time to live our lives. Technology can help us gain time. This is what interests me. So having clarified this, I believe very quickly, and then we will dip in those. Let's talk about now the democratic control of technology. So very concretely, decide democratically of technologies that have potential broad impact on society or the environment. Here I would jump simply to say the consequences. I would evaluate pros and cons, and if we were to decide to adopt technology, define the times, ways, contract, and effective impacts, monitor developments, and use common sense. I emphasize, however, that if we have to preserve the right to decide not to put in place a certain technology, in some cases, the discussion is not how much deciding when you put it in place and how you put it in place. In some cases, even a few, who knows, but the right choice not to put in the field, but we have to preserve the right. Aristotle, I think, said, if I have the power to do something or even the power not to do it, and this is also an ethical question we must set to example. People, including myself, argue that facial recognition should be banned in public spaces for a whole series of issues that we will then argue then on another occasion in live discussions. Self-led weapons, we do not want machines that in a completely autonomous way with a human taking responsibility can decide. I kill a person because it's in a uniform of a certain color, because it has a face of a certain type. Let me simply remind you that the work done with Stefano Rodotà, myself, and many others on the Declaration of the Rights of the Internet, published in 2015, and still very topical, so much that similar initiative can be taken by European Commission, and I'm very happy about this. Radical actions to spread over the power of dominant companies, certainly the digital ones that we have already mentioned, but in general, companies too large, because too large economic power translates into much political power, and there I refer to a very nice lesson held by one of our fellow citizens, even many years ago in London, Tommaso Valenti, for Biennial Democracy in 2021. Held a beautiful lesson just in which an expert, because he deals with the economist, he deals with these things that could be done to reduce concentration of power. And so he find the link in the slide, radical strengthening of public research precisely in order to be able to develop technology that can serve many and that is not being developed now for private forces of the market and cognitive, organizational, productive capacity of the sales. We also need the state to take charge of things that are public goods that are not taken care of by private actors. small technical aspects favor decentralized technical solution. I told you the competition of the word is taking place. Centralized favoring decentralized widespread federal technical solutions. Very broad theme that with an important technical component that we cannot address now. And then last, feed the imagination. The slogan of the 40s, since the 80s, there's a famous phrase of the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher that there's no alternative. The acronym is TINA. 20 years after, the World Social Forum proposed another diametrically opposite slogan. In other words, it's possible. Another digital word is possible. There's a possible alternatives. So let's make a. So we could use the word, assuming they want to do it, and so engineers, computer engineers, scientists in general, they have a very important role because the computer skills they're used to feed a sensible imagination. And this could be possible in a couple of years. So there's a specific role, a specific responsibility to this. So as technicians, we have the duty to put at the service of the community and not of companies our ability to imagine technology. So I'll stop here. I hope I have been able to give you in short some elements on this time so important, so gigantic, as a great challenge represented for digital. Immediately today in our current situation and certainly for the several years to come. And at this point I finish this recorded part, we go live, and then above all I entrust you symbolically to the teacher who will hold the 4 courses in this challenge. Thank you for your attention.
A tra poco.